Estamos por comenzar, así que señoras y señores, les invitamos a ocupar sus lugares desde ahora.
Yes.
Abiertos los micros, de favor, Juan.
Okay. All right.
Por favor, vuelvan a sus lugares mientras damos la bienvenida a nuestros panelistas para la mesa redonda denominada Transformando las políticas macroeconómicas para lograr un crecimiento económico incluyente y sostenible. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated as we welcome our panelists for the roundtable on transforming macro policy to achieve inclusive and sustainable economic growth. Como panelistas tenemos al jefe de Planeación Económica en la Secretaría de Hacienda y Crédito Público de México, el doctor Luis Madrazo Layú. Presentamos al exgobernador del Banco Central de Túnez, el doctor Mustafa Nabli. Exministro de Asuntos Estratégicos de Brasil y fundador del Centro de Políticas Sociales en la Fundación Getúlio Vargas. Bienvenido, doctor Marcelo Neri. Como moderador, tenemos al profesor e investigador del Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económicas, CIDE, doctor Carlos Elizondo Mayer Serra.
Here you go, doctor. Thank you very much. I am very pleased to be an OECD. Vamos a hacerla en inglés.
Great opportunity to have these very prestige and intelligent guests. And I really will focus on the question of the roundtable, which is how do you transform macroeconomic policies to create a more inclusive and sustainable economic development? The Secretary of Hacienda, Luis Videgaray, couldn't assist in the last minute, so I'm very grateful Luis Madrazo is with us. And Professor Jean-Paul Fitoussi had a health problem, and that's why we have this panel. We have a little bit more time. We'll speak for around, well, they will speak for around 45 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes for questions. So let me start with you, Professor Mustafa Nabli, former governor of the central bank. As a former governor of the central bank, you had the responsibility of macroeconomic stability. And in fact, Tunisia was very successful for a while, till the crisis of 2009, where conditions deteriorate quickly, and that led to the revolution, etc. What kind of instruments do you think central banks could have, or more generally, macroeconomic policymakers could have, in order to create a more inclusive economic development?
Thank you. Actually, I thought today is, I was listening to Joe Stiglitz earlier, and I was wondering about what we are going to talk about today. And I thought it might be interesting to tell you this story of Tunisia in a way, and the macro policy. As you mentioned, Tunisia, there was uprising by the end of 2010, early 2011, so-called revolution. And we have been wondering why, what happened? Why did we have this revolution? The political regime collapsed. And when you start to look at the macro, so we are talking about the macro, and actually very puzzling things were happening. When you look at Tunisia in the 2000, from 2000 to 2010, and 2000 2008, say, the macro was extraordinary. It's a perfect case of good macro. You have high growth rates, relatively high growth rates, 4.55% per year, GDP per capita growing by 4%, inequality declining, all the indicators, Gini coefficients, ratio of the top decile to the bottom decile was declining, inflation was low, debt was declining, deficit was low, fiscal deficits were low. It looks like perfect macroeconomic policy, achieving high growth, low inequality, and macro stability, everything perfect. And still, 2 or 3 years later, you had the revolution and the political system collapses. And you wonder why. What happened? So I just want to say 2 things. First, related to what Joe Stiglitz was saying, when we look at the indicators of shared prosperity, when you look at Gini's and so on, is not enough. A few dimensions related to labor markets were really bad. One of them was the unemployment rate of the university graduates. The unemployment rate was reaching 25% of unemployment rates of university graduates, tertiary education graduates. Second, some of the lagging regions. So some of the groups, these are regional groups, geography, and I am puzzled by the Institute of Statistics here. Institutes of Statistics and Geography is interesting to me. Unemployment rates were extremely high. So these 2 dimensions of inclusiveness were really very problematic and were creating a lot of discontent, which is not apparent in this beautiful picture of macro policy. So that's one. The second dimension, which is interesting from the macro policy perspective, is this. Then we had the Great Recession, 2008, 2009, a great shock. The economy started to decelerate. Exports declined by 10% in real terms in 2009. Growth rate declined. Unemployment rates start increasing even more. So what happened to macro policy? Nothing. Macro policy was not responsive at all. Macro policy, the expenditures levels remained the same, the deficit remained the same, despite some willingness to increase some expenditures and some deficit in 2009, 2010. Monetary policy was not responsive, nothing happening on the monetary side. So the question is, why is it in the world that you have an economic situation which is deteriorating in macro perspective and the macro instruments were not being used? And this has been a puzzle to me. Why would this? And this is to illustrate one point. My answer is the following and illustrates one point. Political constraints to macro policies are of the essence. There's something was constraining macro policy to be effective, to be active, more active. What is it? And this is the story in 2 words. The story is that the political regime was under a lot of pressure on the human rights and on corruption issues at the global level. It was under pressure, under stress, because it was very repressive. The regime was politically repressive, and it was cronyism and corruption was widespread and expanding rapidly. And the thing that the regime wanted is to keep a very good image on the financial side. They wanted to keep all of the indicators of macro policy like clean and clear. So they would not do anything to jeopardize the ratings, the sovereign ratings, the international financial institutions to make them unhappy or anything, because they need the funding. So the cost of the macro policy was that to keep it ineffective, inactive, in order to protect their privileges, the political privileges in terms of corruption, cronyism, and continuation of the oppressive regime. So really my point is this, is that macro policy is not in a vacuum. It operates in a political environment. And the political environment puts a lot of constraints on macro policy. So this is before the revolution. And I can tell you another story after the revolution as well, how the political constraints really shape macroeconomic policy and limit its ability to be used in ways which make macroeconomics contribute better to shared prosperity.
Thank you very much. I couldn't agree more than politics is crucial to understand macroeconomic policy. But now we have like the counterexample, which is Brazil, Professor Marcelo Neri. In the case of Brazil, you were the example of anti-cyclical policy. You expanded the public budget, had a very lax monetary policy, and it seemed it was like a success story. But at the end, now you're facing the old-style cyclical crisis that might erode all of the gains that Brazil had in terms of inclusion, growth, etc. What are the lessons from the Brazil case, and what are the challenges being posed right now when you have a deficit of 9 or 8%, very high interest rates, you need to contract the economy, you have a very unpopular president because she gained her second term based on her success story, which wasn't sustainable. What are the main issues on your view here?
Okay, thank you. I think the Brazilian case in some ways is similar, some ways very different from the Tunisia case. I think what Brazil has done since the end of 2003 recession, the reason of success that you mentioned, was a combination of the both sides. So Brazil was kind of going in the middle, growing. We're never an excellent emerging country in terms of growth. This was not, but growth was good for 10 years, for 8, 9 years. On top of that, there was an increase, the labor performance was very good. So there is the Stiglitz, Sen, and Fitosi Commission stressed the role of household income, not only GDP, and household income was growing twice faster than GDP for 8, 9 years. On top of that, inequality was falling on a continuous basis. So we are combining these two, the macro side, not so, not so well as other emerging countries were growing at the world's rate, not as an emerging country rate. But median income, the same one that was stagnated in the US, as Professor Stiglitz mentioned, raised by 90% in real terms in 10 years. So it was a very nice scenario. We had good, like you said, a good reaction in the coming of the crisis, of the 2008 and 2009 crisis. The Keynesian spirits came out, we did the stabilization, etc. The problem is that once the scenario changed, you had supply side restrictions, we kept demand side policies, so wrong policies for the new scenarios. So in 2011 onwards, the macro side started to slow down, inflation to go up, series of macro disequilibrium. Somewhere between 2012 and now, we don't know exactly, there are differences. Inequality stopped falling after 10 years of stopped falling. If you see life satisfaction and evaluation of public services statistics, it's a very good, I'm saying that a posteriori, okay? It's a very good indicator of demonstrations in Brazil. Like there was huge deterioration between 2011 and 2012. So we lost people's ideas, aspirations. There was some frustration in spite of and the labor market in Brazil was going still very well until very recently. The December unemployment rate is the lowest in the series, and now just like 6 months later, we are back to where we were 6 years ago. So it's a very, very sharp downturn. So Brazil lost all its qualities one by one. The demonstrations in 2013, I think there's an interesting parallel with the Tunisian case. It was not, in my opinion, because of lack of social. There is the corruption part that, people in demonstrations say that explicitly. But this was not what was behind the demonstrations. One thing that I think there's a parallel with the Tunisia case. I think this idea that we have, social networks, and this is the main technology. When you analyze what are the reasons or the main determinants of demonstrations, in the Brazilian case, the main variable is the active use of social networks, not only access but use. So there is a new technology there. But when you look at the data, it's very different from the Occupy Wall Street movement, where the unemployed people against inequality. There you cannot reject in the data the idea that inequality fall was not the reason behind the demonstration, was somewhat a reason behind the demonstration. You cannot reject this hypothesis, so I would like to bring that. Because people who use the internet in the Brazilian case are people who are above the median. It's not everyone have access. So, but now the situation is very uncertain from all aspects, macro side, politically, in all aspects. And I think that the main problem of Brazil is to deviate from this middle path. We were kind of balancing both sides, social and economic, in a nice way, and then maybe we left the macro side, the investor side. We didn't give too much attention to this side, and this was the cause of the deterioration.
Gracias. Luis, the case of Mexico seems to be a little bit in the middle run between the two of them, because after the 2008 crisis, macroeconomic policy did react, but at the same time, the economy collapsed abruptly. But the political system didn't explode, but the the election of the year 12 led to a new party in government. So in terms of politics, it has been more stable than Tunis. But it's also true that in terms of growth, it has been very mediocre in the past 20 years, in spite of having had a very stable macroeconomic environment. Inclusion has been very negative in terms of many indicators. The new data of poverty indicates that we are still accumulating more poor people than before. We did these very important structural reforms in the year 13 and 14, but still growth is low. What are the instruments you think should be developed more thoroughly? What are the policies that could be followed in order to increase growth and increase inclusiveness?
Thank you, Carlos, very much for this opportunity. I'd like to first address it a little bit in theory, the question, and then bring it back down to Mexico. Now, the question for the panel is there a trade-off between growth and inequality? And I think if we had to give a yes or no answer, and following a little bit in the footsteps of Professor Stiglitz, the answer would be no. I think there's a growing awareness that inclusion and equality needs to be elements to make growth, at least sustainable growth, stronger. But I think if we just ask that question narrowly, it misses the point a little bit. Because inequality and growth have been related in different ways at different stages in development. And not only that, if you define growth more broadly, as you should probably in your policy objectives, as something akin to sustainable development, you should probably have many objectives. It's not a one single objective development policy. And many of those objectives are related to equality. Equality of opportunity, certainly a minimum protection, and that is probably politically defined in each country. So Professor Stiglitz mentioned his grievance that maybe if we thought there was a trade-off, we had been making wrong decisions. But if we think they always have to be aligned, maybe we'll miss some opportunities to have a broad-based policy arsenal for sustainable development. That includes elements of equality, sometimes in support of growth, and sometimes that are independent of growth. It's a legitimate policy objective, and it's a legitimate political environment. So how does this relate to Mexico? I think you stated very well, Mexico has had macroeconomic stability for a long time. It's something that took us a while to build. But for the past 20 years, Mexico has had an independent monetary policy that has given us very low inflation, very credible. Despite fluctuations in the exchange rate, inflation expectations were anchored. Our fiscal policy has been prudent for a long time. We're ratifying that in the budget that's being processed right now. But growth has been disappointed, and it has been disappointing for a while. And maybe one of the elements missing into that policy mix for the past 20 years has had to do a little bit with inequality, or a lot, and with inclusion. And that's why the motto for the structural reforms that have been implemented in the past 2 years is to democratize productivity, to bring opportunity to everybody in the economy, and that should be a big boost to economic growth. If you look at the most discussed reforms, they're obviously focused on increasing productivity, and for everybody, not just for the few. The most obvious ones are competition policy, energy policy, the input industries that have been excluded from previous reforms, no? Electricity, oil. You also have telecoms and other regulatory reforms, competition, as I mentioned, and of course the labor market. We also had financial reform and fiscal reform. But let me now go into how some of these policies are directly related to inclusion, and two further elements that I have not mentioned so far, which are the inclusion policy and the fiscal reform, no? Where there's new incentives to bring people into the formal sector. And if you look at the numbers of how the formal payrolls in Mexico have been growing over the past 2 years, they've been growing at over 4%, which is faster than economic growth. That shows a very clear process of formalization. And some people see it, well, that's not sustainable. I would add, no. This is on top of the economic growth. We're getting a process of formalization, and that should lead to a minimum protection for people in terms of pension and healthcare, and probably it will raise their productivity in the long term. Let me show an additional element that I think complements the package of structural reforms we have in Mexico, which is special economic zones for the South. I think if you look at the hard data for the past 30 years, in economic growth terms, we've had a very strong success story in the north of the country and now in the middle of the country. I'm talking geographically. Regions that have grown in productivity are an export-led growth, manufacturing-based economy. But we really haven't brought into that economy the rest of the country, or at least the southern part and southeastern part of the country. So I think the structural reforms are meant to increase productivity for everybody. In that terms, they're inclusive, and that should probably lead to higher economic growth. But you also need to make sure that in each one of those policies, financial, fiscal, labor, education in particular, you have an element of inclusion to bring everybody into this dynamic of growth and increased productivity. And we have in those reforms that I mentioned, specific elements, particularly financial reform has an element of financial inclusion. Education reform is probably the most important. You mentioned we had the reforms 2 years ago and we haven't seen the increase in growth. There are structural reforms, and you wouldn't expect them to have an impact immediately. You would expect the impact to come in across time. But I think you already start to see some of the elements that structural reform has had in the dynamics of growth. And Mexico, despite having growth that is similar to what we had for the past 20 years, and that has happened in a context in which the world economy has slowed down. And not only that, you really need to look at again, how do you measure economic performance? One of the elements that is really affecting the numbers for GDP is oil production and the price of oil. And if you strip that away, which is something that's very important for public finances, and it definitely goes into our GDP accounts, and you look at the internal dynamics of the economy, you already see a very good dynamic. I mentioned earlier, strong labor market growth, an increased formality, low unemployment. That has led to increased real salaries, accompanied by slowing inflation. And if you look at the consumption numbers, that's what sustained Mexican growth for the past 2 years. It's been the internal market, as opposed to what we've seen in the years before that, which was an export-led growth with lackluster performance in the internal market. So even though growth has stayed pretty much the same with the start of economic structural reforms, the composition has changed, and I think that holds promise for the future. We continue to sustain a stronger dynamic in the internal market, increase productivity as the world economy recovers, particularly the United States, as it pulls out of a very slow recovery, and we get the energy reform working for us. Those two drag elements should be complementing instead of subtracting from growth going forward. Thank you, Carlos.
We're moving we're dealing not only with strictly macroeconomic policy, as both Luis mentioned with the structural reforms, and Marcelo mentioned when dealing with the fact that there was no supply, that there were no effort to take away these supply restrictions that didn't allow the Brazilian economy to grow. So I would like to return to Tunis, trying to understand what are like the current both structural and political restrictions that have made it so difficult for the new government to create that type of growth that society was expecting, not only because revolution usually creates great expectations, but because prior to the revolution, the economy was growing in a very, at a very high level and with very good indicators overall. So I would return with you, Mr. Nabli, please.
As I was mentioning that the constraint on macro policy before the revolution was really political. Now this restriction, this limitation completely went away after the revolution. So the door was open for very active macro policy, actually. And there was. So since 2011, especially the fiscal policy was extremely active. The fiscal deficit went from -1% to -4%. Fiscal deficit multiplied by 4. The expenditures as a percent of GDP went by 4 or 5% of GDP. So there was a massive fiscal stimulus package, series of packages, 2011, 12, 13, 14, continues to 15. Monetary policy was also, at least at the early stages, in 2011, relatively accommodative, lower interest rates, higher growth of money and so on, but it became a little bit less accommodative afterwards because inflation went up very dramatically, from 3% to 6% and more. Now, the problem is that the use of this fiscal instrument and so on proved to be ineffective. What you would have expected in terms of growth, in terms of shared prosperity and so on, did not happen. Actually, all of the indicators of shared prosperity worsened since 2010. Growth collapsed, unemployment went up, inflation went up, poverty probably went up, we don't have the numbers yet, inequality probably went up, everything is really worsened. Despite very active monetary fiscal, especially fiscal policy and so on. And the question is why? We are really at the opposite extreme of the pre-revolution situation. So what's happening? My assessment is that what's happened is that first, the nature of the fiscal policy was wrong. The composition of the fiscal policy and fiscal stimulus was wrong. The essence of the increase in expenditures was in two parts: increase in salaries of public servants, an increase in public sector employment, and increase in subsidies on consumer goods. And this have very limited multiplier effects. Actually, the impact, the attempts to increase investment and so on was extremely limited and ineffective. So that's one reason. But the second is more important, I think. And by the way, this is really driven by the politics. It's driven by the politics because after the revolution and the turmoil and the uprisings and so on, you wanted to make people feel that they got something out of this revolution. So you increase the salaries, you give them public sector jobs, you try to not increase the price of fuel, you don't increase the price of bread, despite the increase in commodity prices since 2010, 11, 12, and so on. So that's one. The second, I think, which is more important, is that, and related to the structure and so on, really the constraint to growth was not macro anymore. The constraint was political. The political uncertainty and the turmoil and the lack of credibility of policies was really constraining growth. Investors were turning away, because there was no stability, the political situation was very, very fragile, and the security situation was fragile, and the prospects were not very clear. So the uncertainty and so on is really the reason for that. So once you have this situation where there is really macro uncertainty dominating the situation, the instrument, the standard instruments, whether monetary or fiscal, are not going to have any impact. And we are in that situation. What we need now, turning to your question, is really very serious stabilization of the political situation, of the security situation, and then major structural reforms to deal with the fundamental issues, whether it is about the investment, the education system, the training, the skills, and all of these things which are very difficult to do while you are in the transition, democratic transition. So we have a situation again where the macro is really constrained by the political, but in different sense. Because really macro, to my mind, macro at this stage cannot play much of a role, actually, in terms of achieving shared prosperity. The game is really played somewhere else. And that's where we are today.
Thank you. Now, Marcelo, in the case of Brazil, you have a terrible, daunting challenge ahead, which is you have to do structural reforms to confront some of these supply side problems, all the restrictions that the Brazilian economy has, all the protectionist inheritance of these past 12 years or whatever. You have a terrible macroeconomic situation, and you have to think about how to protect the worst offs that were finally giving some economic space thanks to the growth of the last 10 years under a very complex political situation. How can you confront those challenges? What would be your suggestion to the president if she were to ask you, what do I have to do now? Of course, there are political constraints. There are always political constraints, but how do you deal with them?
I think it will be very hard to avoid the political constraints. I think it's because it's knocking on the door right now. So it's, but I think there is a big risk that I think it's a very good question, because maybe you try to do a fiscal adjustment like we are trying to do now, but things which will really not solve the fiscal situation in Brazil. I mean, we really have to do the social security reform, labor reforms. We need to do that. It's a structural thing. So if you do a short-run adjustment, you maybe buy 1 year, but people will look down in the horizon and see, well, you're going to have problems, you know, in a few months, so you start having problems now. So what Brazil really needs is to do the full round of structural reforms like Mexico is doing for the last 3 years, of course, adapting. You know, a productivity increase, it's in the agenda in Brazil, all over Latin America. We have to implement that to do more like mainstream. I think the case of Brazil, if you look, for example, even in the last 3-4 years, share prosperity indicators in Brazil, I calculate them, are beautiful. You know, I mean, growing 5-6% a year during the bad macro period. Of course, this is not sustainable. So Brazil, I think, provides the lessons that when sometimes you think you're reaching the end results, and you're really reaching that, so okay, that's it. And then the workings of the economy just going to fall. So Brazil really has to adopt structural reforms, and I think this is important for Brazil, but also for Latin America. We have to read more Angus Deaton type of work. We are very low savings, family savings countries. We have to do reforms to increase the incentives for savings there. We have to open more the economy in a way that other countries in the region have been doing. We are not attached to these Trans-Pacific and other agreements, trade agreements. I think the good news I can say that because I'm outside the government, after my gardening leave, so I can say that. That's the good part. I think Brazil should really join OECD, and I think we are on the track. Before, Brazil didn't want to join OECD. It was a supply side decision. We don't want to be part of the first division. We want to be the leaders in the second division, which I think was a bad choice, okay? But now I think we are, I think there is really started a movement of joining the OECD and, to try to do more mainstream type of reforms, looking at supply side. So we have I think in the case of Brazil, more than in Latin America, we have to open our economy, not only in terms of trade and capital account, but also in terms of people's account, immigration. We are very close economy in terms of immigration. Only 0.3% of the population is first-generation immigrants. Latin America is 1.2%, the world is 3%, Australia is like 15%, so it's 50 times bigger. So we have to to do more standard, opening, reforms, and this is the agenda, but will be very hard because the political situation is very difficult, and so Brazil is the kind of case where the benefits accrue to the population. Inequality fell for 10 years in a row, but we are in the middle of a big mess, both macroeconomically and politically.
Thank you. Luis, the government of Mexico recently produced a spot trying to defend the reforms, which basically was based on the idea of two people talking and one defending the reform and telling the other one, ya chole con tus quejas, stop complaining, because things are better than what you think. And I think that's one of the dilemmas that the Mexican policymakers have right now. One, they oversold the reforms. It is true that they are structural reforms, but when they were being sold, it seemed that growth would be arriving earlier. In fact, if you look at the Criterios Generales de Política Económica of the first year of this administration, we should be growing faster now than when we are growing. Of course, it's a more difficult international environment. Oil production went down in a way that no one could envisage, but the population was expecting reforms to kick on quicker, and it has happened in a way in certain sectors, but in terms of growth, people are not really looking at it. And secondly, if you look at the OECD reform, the OECD reports, they claim that the reform should give us 1 additional point of GDP per year once they are implemented, but we would have 1 additional point of GDP if we were to do 2 major reforms. One is creating some sort of rule of law, strengthening the rule of law in Mexico, and secondly, doing a more thorough labor reform. One of the things that I'm worried about this administration is that they think they've already done labor reform, while what they did was really very limited. So what are the challenges that this administration has for the second half of this administration? One, making people understand the benefits of the reforms that have already taken place, how, and which are the pending reforms in order to capture the full benefits of the reforms that have already taken place.
Thank you, Carlos, for your question. And let me approach this question by saying, yes, things have changed since the reform agenda was presented, and particularly the international environment has changed, and for Mexican public finances, the oil price has changed, and that although the Mexican economy is much less dependent on oil and our exports are a very small percentage, it does have an influence on our public finances, much less than a few years ago. So things have changed in that sense, and the management of expectations is part of the reform process. I would argue that the structural reform process is an ongoing process, and it will be an ongoing process for a very long time. They're structural, and they'll take a very long time. They are, in a sense, very ambitious, but they'll play out over a long period of time. But you're saying, what else can you do, and what are the limits to what a government can do? And I think that brings us back a little bit to what you said at the beginning. No? Mexico as maybe a middle ground between what some of the experiences of Tunisia and Brazil. And I think Mexico has kept macroeconomic stability. We built upon that for 20 years. We've made a big effort in terms of structural reform to increase productivity and growth. And I also think that macroeconomic policy can complement and can be conducive to protecting inclusion and to having a counter-cyclical component. But it's very important that countries do it in a prudent fashion. I think Mexico, for the first time in the past, well, ever probably, after the global financial crisis, and again in 2013, did manage to put in place macroeconomic policies that were counter-cyclical. They were moderate, they were modest, but they were counter-cyclical. We were not forced to go the wrong way in those points. But there are limits to that, and Mexico needs to be very prudent to keep its base of stability. I think Brazil is a perfect example of that. And I think Mexico is doing that. So I think it's a twin challenge. You need to preserve stability. You need to make a certain effort on a fiscal front, which of course is always painful. No? Cutting expenditures is never something easy for either the government or the economy. But having that as a base of support is the best impulse that macroeconomic policy can have on development and economic performance, is recognizing the limits that we've had in putting in place a counter-cyclical policy. And beyond that, to continue the implementation of the reform agenda is what will bring, obviously, an increase in productivity in the long run, but also the implementation of the structural reforms, not all of them, but some of them, will start to have an immediate effect in the economy. I think probably one of the most complicated ones was telecoms reform. And telecoms reform has had a big impact in making it credible that it's a contestable market and bringing in investment. That has changed the environment. That has changed tariffs. The energy reform, even in a very hostile environment for petroleum, very low prices, lots of volatility, Mexico started having an auctioning process, and that will bring investment. So the structural reform process will take a long time to be fully implemented, but the sooner it's implemented and the higher the quality of the implementation is, it will start having an impact in the short run as well.
Thank you very much. Before we turn to the public for their questions, is anyone wants to react to what your colleagues have said? Is there anything from what Tunisia example, the Brazilian, the Mexican, that you think we should engage into a more specific dialogue? No? Well, not having that, we have this very modern system that should allow us to have questions from the public. Let me see if we have any. No, there's anything in this system, very modern, very nice, but I should have some questions here, which I don't. So we'll open to the there's a new system coming, thank you. It's always good having a spare part. So we have some questions here. The first one is for Luis Madrazo, which is currently should be displayed there, and is what changes need to be made in economic policy to achieve the 2013 agenda on macro level? So if you want to answer that, Luis.
Well, again, I think macroeconomic policy right now is an essential element. It's one of the three elements for economic policy. I think Mexico has put in place a structural reform agenda that will take a long time to implement. But the other two legs that our economic policy stands on are macroeconomic stability in both monetary policy and fiscal policy. And I think we are facing challenges. No? I think Mexico has a flexible exchange rate. Mexico has had a flexible exchange rate for 20 years, and a credible monetary policy has allowed us to have the exchange rate function as a shock absorber. But one of the essential elements for that to work properly is to have a well-functioning exchange rate market, and we have had the Exchange Rate Commission set up a policy to assure that we have liquidity and order in our market, so that our exchange rate policy complements our monetary policy and continues to bring stability, a stable base for macroeconomic growth to take place. And the biggest challenge, and I think that's on macro terms the biggest issue right now in Mexico, is of course fiscal policy. No? There's been a large drop in the price of oil. Mexico, as I said, depends a lot less on oil for public finances. Only 3 years ago, it was 40% of our revenue. Now it's less than 20%. But still, it requires us to adjust. And there's only three ways to do that. We could either raise taxes. Mexico has already had an important fiscal reform. We've adjusted to it, and we wanted to bring stability to the fiscal base. So we don't feel that there's a need to do any further adjustments to taxes, no new taxes. We also have, as you mentioned earlier, and I complimented, counter-cyclical stimulus 2 years ago, and we're moving back to having a zero deficit by 2017 in our narrow definition. So Mexico has a path to begin stabilizing the debt to GDP ratio. It will actually stabilize next year and will start going down in 2018. And that's a very important element to, again, keep stability in their fiscal accounts. But in order to keep bringing deficit down and not raise new taxes, we will need to make cuts in expenditures. And that gives us an opportunity, although cuts in expenditures are always painful, as I said, for both the government and the economy. It's a moderate adjustment we need to make. We need to cut 1.2% of GDP, and we've already made a precautionary cut this year that got us almost halfway there. But it's also an opportunity to have a review of our expenditures in Mexico. And I think that's something that almost everybody agrees in Mexico. After 10 years of high oil prices and an increase in our expenditures over 5% every year, we had the opportunity this year, because we started early on for the 2016 budget, to review our expenditures. And we had help from the World Bank. We had a lot of outside opinion, but also a very thorough review inside of the government. And I think all of those insights will help us not only for the budget 2016, which is currently being debated by Congress, but also it should give us a further insight on how best to spend scarce government resources going forward. And I think there's a lot of work to be done going forward, and the full implementation of that review should come over the next few years. And there are certain elements in that expenditure review that will help the economy, that will help, but not only the economic performance, it will help the functioning of the state. And one of those elements, as you mentioned, is justice and the fight against corruption. So there's a big change in the judicial system going on right now. Part of that is part of the expenditure review will require additional expenditures, and that's contained in the public expenditure review. So there's a lot of work going forward in terms of expenditure.
Let me react very quickly to that. People were expecting a much ambitious presupuesto base cero, a more ambitious review of the current expenditures. And in fact, one of the items that got the harshest cut was investment. The budget of investment will decrease 20%, if I recall precisely, while current expenditures in general got a very small decrease. So isn't this a reflection of the incapacity because of several political restrictions of actually doing the correct review of public expenditure, which imply disappearing certain programs, firing people, things that are politically very costly?
But I would take a two-stage answer to that. The first is that there are some changes that you can do, but that you can't do overnight. So as I said, some of the expenditure review insights should come in over time and should help you redirect resources going forward. But on what we have done, and there has been an important adjustment in the investment budget, but I do think we need to place into context. Mexico is a country and a government that owns a large petroleum company. And as the price of oil fell, all large petroleum companies and all oil companies have had to revise their investment budgets for the years going forward. So that's a big element of what you see in the budget, and that's natural and that's consistent with an efficient use of resources in a new price environment. But more importantly, and I think it was in a sense timely and fortunate that we've had an important energy liberalization reform before. Because what's important for economic growth is not so much how much you budget for investment by the government, it's how much you mobilize for productive investments. And by having an energy reform in the previous years that will now allow our energy sector and our state company, Pemex, to make use of the elements that all other companies have at their disposal. The energy sector is one in which you need to have a lot of risk management and associations and partnerships, and that's something Pemex has not had available up to now. Now Pemex has that. So Pemex, with less budgetary resources, can probably mobilize as much or as many resources as it needs for the new price reality going forward. There's also other elements in the budget, and which we've introduced different financial vehicles to help mobilize not only public sector, but private sector investment. So I would argue that we have the elements to have as vigorous an investment mobilization by the state going forward, and it is a big question of implementation. It is a big challenge, but that's, that comes with the territory. When you have a large number of important reforms, then you need to go forward and implement them, and it depends on how well you do that, how fast and how big an impact you have on growth and various aspects of sustainable development. Thank you, Carlos.
It's being displayed right now. In Brazil, what kind of macro policies would be suitable to promote economic growth and a more equitable distribution of its fruits?
Okay. I think what Brazil has done until the crisis and even during the 2018 was we could have better growth, but we had quite first time inequality fell for successive years, so it was quite well balanced. I think the problem was the reaction with the crisis, not the immediate reaction, but afterwards. These policies that did work well during when demand side was the problem were kept in place, so some of the fiscal stimulus or some of the price controls that were put in place, and this created distortions in the economy. So I think Brazil has to do the bread and butter part. We did Brazil has a very interesting system of evaluating proficiency at different levels, budget. We have, many of the things, a democratic system. We have a very good justice system, with independence, which I think will allow us, after this crisis, to come out stronger. But what we have to do more is to do more standard textbook type of analysis. I think we were way too out of that. So in a way, we didn't realize the potential of investments and that to attract foreign investors and to do domestic investments that we had. So I think it's we have to do supply side type of policies. We have to do the reforms. But I think the biggest constraint in Brazil, more than political, what I feel the country is very divided. That's although if you measure polarization in Brazil from objective perspective, either in education or income, you never see the country as close, like the Sugar Loaf, you have two mountains. These mountains were never so close before in objective terms. But there is a hate in society that's very difficult to deal with. And Brazil, we are very famous for that. Part of our problems is that we are very averse to conflicts. That's part of our culture. We didn't have big revolutions like you had here in Mexico, and this is part. And now we are in a situation where the conflict, it's imminent, in a way, and we don't know how to deal with that. So
well, if that is not a political constraint, that is a political constraint.
Yes, but it's behind, it's deep,
It's even more profound, yeah.
Yeah, we need leadership, therapy, but will be very hard because of this division that we have.
Grazie. Now, Mr. Nabil, this is your question. How can macro policy respond to security threats? That is it wise to increase welfare spending to battle extremism and polarization?
Actually, I don't think that the increase in expenditures was in response to extremism. The increase in public expenditures was really to respond to the motivations of those people who went to the streets, were asking for jobs because they had university degrees and they did not get jobs. They are the ones who are in the lagging regions who are not getting any opportunities and so on. So it was aimed at those people. Now, in principle, there is in principle that this situation in these young people who lose hope, who don't have any options for the future and so on, become easy targets for the extremists. And they can be captured, especially if the extremists have a lot of resources. What we have seen is that the extremists have a lot of resources, financial resources to put on the table. So they're able to capture these young people who are, finding no future and have no prospects for a job or for life or for, So putting some money during the transition period in order to, kind of reduce that pressure, I think makes a lot of sense politically. I don't have a problem with that. The problem is how much can you do it, how much of it, and for how long? Because it's not the solution. It is something that you can do in the transitory phase for a while in order to calm things down, to reduce the tensions and so on. But it's not a solution. The solution is that to create the real jobs, to create the real opportunities, to create the real options and prospects for this use. And this goes by the what we are talking about all along, the structural reforms that need to be done. And in education, in the training, in the supply side. I give you one figure. It gives you the scope of the problem that we're facing today. The investment rate in Tunisia, which was around 25% of GDP before the revolution, has collapsed now. To what number? We are at 17, 18%. In space of a few years, there is a collapse of the investment rate by 7 percentage points of GDP. It's huge. It means that the problem is on the supply side today. How do you engineer a recovery of the growth, engineer recovery of investment, both domestic, both foreign investment, household investment, and government investment, and so on? That's really the challenge that we have today. We face extremism. We cannot face extremism if we are not creating the jobs, if we are not improving the lives of the people, giving them the right education, giving them the right opportunities.
I have 4 more minutes, and I'm going to use them. Very quickly, I would like each of you to give your final thoughts on the topic, and we will start with you, Luis, please.
Well, I think I'll go back to the beginning and say that if we had to give a straight answer, the answer is probably no. There's not a clear trade-off between inequality and growth, but that there is a very broad spectrum of goals when you have a sustainable development policy, that equality should be certainly one of those elements, that it's defined differently at different times in different places, but it should be an integral part of policy debate. And I would go even further and say, and even if at some points you bump into areas in which they are at odds and in which you can find trade-offs, you can make decisions, and you can have decisions made on a quality basis. So I'm not too afraid of saying there's never a trade-off, but when there are trade-offs, you can make it as part of your policy discussion, and that will be defined by politics and at each country and at different times in the world. But there is no large trade-off, I would argue. And I think Mexico is working hard with structural reform to prove that. So let's hope implementation of that in Mexico will give us a good case study a few years down the road.
Gracias. Marcelo, please.
I think the main challenge, besides what I said, is to evaluate what we have done. I think Brazil experimented lots of different programs and different innovations, but we really don't know what are the returns of different social policies. Because, Brazil, we have a big government. When you have a big government, so the government, applies the policies. It's different from, for example, some Central American countries where lots of the policies are delegated to third persons, so it's natural to hire other institutions to evaluate what has been done. There, what we need, and that's what we have not done, is evaluation, because the government doesn't want to evaluate himself. That's a kind of, so we really have to work to learn of what we have done, and in a time where the fiscal space is shrinking, we're gonna have to do, but we better do it in an efficient way to cut the programs where they are less target, they give less sustainability, but so we developed this agenda of evaluation, but I don't think Brazil really grasped that, and I think this is the main opportunity we have to take advantage in the middle of this crisis.
Thank you, Mr. Nabli, please.
What I wanted to really emphasize is 2 points, essentially. One is that when we talk about the impact of policies, including macro policy, but applies for any policy, is really make sure that when you look at the indicators of shared prosperity, don't focus on one indicator, whether it's inequality or poverty or anything. There is a broad set of indicators about shared prosperity that you should be aware about, and you never know which one is going to be the one which is exploding in your face. The one that is exploding in your face, if you are in politics, you never know which one it is. It's not necessarily poverty. It's not necessarily inequality. It may be something that you are not be aware of. So be careful. Look at a broad set of indicators, and I think it's really related to all the subject of this theme. The second point I would like to emphasize is that, especially in macro policy, be aware of the capture of macro policy by special interests. If macro policy is captured by a special interest, this is really very dangerous. And coming back to just to illustrate, I forgot to make this small point. Prior to the revolution, one thing was happening was credit to the economy was being captured by a very small elite, narrow cronyism so credit was growing to the economy, which was growing to a number of people, which was very specific. And we observed the same thing in Egypt, by the way. This is recent data and work that showed that prior to the revolution, whether Egypt, Tunisia, all of the credit growth prior to the revolution was going to a very narrow set of firms. And this, probably squeezing the rest of the economy, was not creating the opportunity for a shared prosperity for the rest, because there was a capture of the part of the economy, of the credit in this case, by a narrow group. And I think be aware of the capture of the economy of a macro policy by narrow groups, narrow interests. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all of you. It was a very interesting panel. Thanks to you for your patience, and we'll continue. Thank you.